Hello everyone, it is Press Any Button coming back at you with another Unity tutorial, and I just want to start off with a quick apology for my absence from the channel. It's been half due to the fact that I've been a bit busy lately, and it's been half due to the fact that I've been a bit lazy lately. But do not worry about that, because this time we are back with another Unity tutorial, and these things are going to become more consistent. So without further introduction, let's get straight into what we're doing this lesson. So I'm going to hit the play button and show you what I've come up with and what we're going to achieve by the end of this part. As you should remember from last time, we got our player moving and we set some restrictions or boundaries for our player movement. Now in this lesson, what we're going to be doing, and what you can already see on screen, is that we're going to be creating shots. Now there's a couple of things that are happening here right now. The first thing is that these shots are being instantiated from the position of the tank. The next important thing to highlight is that if you take a look at the hierarchy, you can see that our shots are indeed disappearing when they leave the view of the main camera, which is what we're also going to work on. And another thing is, if you can hear this properly, which you probably can, we've adjusted the fire rate of our bullets so that we don't have too many on screen at the same time, and so that we have the same kind of feel that's present in traditional Space Invaders, where our tank isn't shooting shots like an assault rifle or something. So now that we've got that out of the way and we know what we're going to do, I'm just going to clean up the hierarchy so we can continue building the game together. So I'll be back in a second. Okay, so now that I've cleared up the hierarchy in the workspace, you'll notice that there's a couple of things that are still different. Now one of the things that I want to just get into before we get into making our bullets and things is organization. So under the project tab, you can see that we've got this create option, and that's how we create new folders, which you can see here. I've got a couple new folders just to house my materials, my scenes and my scripts. To create a new folder, I'll just go through it with you because we actually have a relevant folder to create. What we need to do is hit create folder, and then from here we can name our folder whatever we want, and I'm going to call this Prefab. So just following those steps, make sure you have a materials folder, a prefabs folder, a scenes folder and a scripts folder. Once you've got that sorted, just drag those items into the relevant folders, just as you would with your normal folders in your normal save spaces on your PC or Mac. So now that you've seen that I've created a prefabs folder, we should have a prefab. Now I'll explain what a prefab is once we've made our shot. So the first thing that we want to do is go over to our hierarchy and either hit create or right click and then hit create empty. And make sure you haven't got anything highlighted because we're not trying to make anything the child of anything right now. Once you've got that game object, I want you to go to this little cog icon and hit reset. And then its position on the Z-axis should be set to 4, or whatever you set your player's position to on the Z-axis. For this game that I'm building, it's 4, so my game object needs to be 4. Right after we've done that, we just want to right click or hit create again, and then we're going to go to 3D object and capsule. And this is going to be our shot. This can be a temporary job, or we can keep this in for the final game. It doesn't really matter because we're not concentrating too much on the visuals right now. We're just concentrating on getting this game mechanic to work. So the first thing we want to do to this is to reset all of its properties. So let's hit reset on that cog again. And then we just want to scale this object down relative to the size of our player object so it doesn't look too goofy or anything. So let's make this 0.25, 0.25, and 0.25 again. And then all we have to do with this object is make it a child of our game object right here. And to do that, we simply select it in the hierarchy and drag it over our game object. And as you can see, it's become a child of that object. Because if we toggle this arrow here, we can see that it's part of the game object drop down, and thus has become a child of this game object. Real quick, let's actually rename this game object right here. So if we double click slowly here, we can rename this, and I'm going to call this shot. And then I'm going to call this capsule object beam. And that should be it for renaming things. The next thing that we're going to do to our empty game object is select it, and as you can see, we don't have any visual indication that this is actually in our scene, and that's why we added the beam game object, because this is actually how we'll be able to see the bullet. But right here on the parent game object, we're going to add a couple of things. The first thing that we want to add is a rigid body. So to do that, as you just saw me do, we click on Add Component, Physics, and then Rigid Body. Now, having a rigid body will allow us to reference this object once we add our script to it, which we're going to do in just a second. The first thing that we want to do though to our rigid body is to make sure that we're not using gravity, because that won't end too well for us. And once we've done that, we want to go to Add Component, New Script, and then we're going to call this script Shot. But as you can see, I've already got a script called Shot, so if I were to do Shot 1, I could click Create and Add, but I don't need to right now because I've already got my scripts prepared. But for you guys, what you want to do is click Create and Add, and that will add the script to this game object. In terms of having a pre-existing script, we can either go to Add Component, Scripts, and then attach it like that, or I can just drag it over to the game object, just as if I was trying to make it a child of the object, and right there we can see that we've got our script. Now let's hop into MonoDevelop to see how our script is actually constructed and what it actually does for us. So to take a look at our script, we either want to right click on it here, or we can select it and then press Open. Okay, so here we are in MonoDevelop, and as you can see, I have my script ready, and it's actually pretty simple. So I'm just going to walk you through this. Right here we've got a public float, and we've called that speed. Now this allows me in the inspector for the game object to manipulate the speed of our object. We then continue on to void start, and under this we have get component rigid body. So right now we're actually referencing the game object that the rigid body component is attached to. And that's why we had to attach the rigid body to our empty game object, so that we could reference it here in the script. And once we set up that reference, we follow it up with dot velocity. And then we've got some information here on the direction that our component is going to travel on. Now, one thing that you might notice is that this script is very similar to the script that we were working with in the bullets tutorial if you've been around on the channel for that long. But there's one difference this time around. Transform.up actually used to be transform.forward. Now, we had to change that because we're working in Unity's 2D mode. If we kept it at transform.forward, our bullet would actually travel along the z-axis, which isn't what we want, because it would either collide with our background or go straight through it and not be viewable and not really useful at all. So we've got transform.up here instead, which means that our bullet is going to travel positively along the y-axis. And that's pretty much all we have to do for this script. Once we have that all sorted, we can go over to File, and then Save, and then return to Unity. Now that we're back in Unity, we can take a look at how our bullet moves. But there's one thing that we should probably do to make sure that we can see our bullet well enough, and that is to add a material. So if you've got a materials folder, I want you to click on that just to enter it, and then I want you to right click while in the materials folder and then go to Create Material. Now we've done this before, and this is very simple. Right next to where it says albedo, you'll see a white box. Click on that, and that should open your color menu. Now choose a color that you want to use. I'm going to go with a turquoise again. And once we've selected our color, we just close the menu. The next thing that we need to do on the inspector for the material is to go to Shader, Unlit, and then Texture. And this will make sure that we can really see our object. And we see that it's kind of white, but to be honest, this doesn't matter because this probably isn't going to be a permanent thing. Finally, we need to attach the material to a relevant game object. So we can't attach it to this empty game object that's holding our beam, but we can attach it to the beam itself. So let's just select our material, hold down left click, and just drag it over to the beam game object, just as you would if you were trying to attach a child to it. And as you can see, we've got our new material attached to the beam game object. We don't really need to worry about naming this material. But just to show you how you can do that, just click on the label below it once you've already clicked on it, and then we can call this temp, because this is probably going to be temporary. Now we know our object appears in the scene view, but let's take a look at it in the game view. And as expected, we can't actually see it. And the reason for this is that it is at -4 relative to the position of our empty game object, which is at 4. So we want it to just be at origin. So without hitting the reset cog, because that will also reset the scale of our object, we just want to go to the box for the position on the z-axis and then hit 0 and then enter. And as you can see, our bullet is right there, or beam, or whatever we shoot in Space Invaders. Now that we've got that sorted, let's press play and see what happens with this game object. Well, unsurprisingly, our object isn't moving because there's one thing that we neglected to do, which is add a value for speed to it. So once we've exited the play mode, we should go back to our shot game object and input a value of about 5 for our shot, but this can vary depending on what you actually want. Now let's press play and see what happens. Now, as you may have been able to see there, our shot left the scene in the intended direction at around about the speed that we wanted it to travel at. But it's not really useful just having one shot, because that means that we won't be able to repeat shooting shots. So what we need to do is we need to make this object a prefab. So let's go over to our prefabs folder, and to make something a prefab, we simply drag it into our project folder. Once we've done that, we have a prefab, and let me demonstrate how a prefab works. So having a prefab means that I've got multiple instances of the same game object. So if I enter the scene view here, you can see that as I drag this game object into our view, we have multiple instances of it, and I can keep going all day long and it won't affect much, except from our performance, because as you can see, as I'm adding all of these prefabs, they're not going anywhere. And that's something that we're going to remedy later on down the line. But the first thing that we need to do is to control how we have these shots enter our scene. So once we're out of play mode again, what we want to do is we want to go to the hierarchy, click on create, and then we're going to create another empty game object. Now the purpose of this empty game object is to dictate where the shots will be fired from. So naturally we want to first attach it to our player object, and then we can call this shot spawn. Once we've done that, let's reset its positioning and all of its values to origin by hitting that cog and then going to reset, which means that it is now in origin relative to the tank. But that's not quite where we want to fire our shots from. So let's mess around with some values for a second to see how this can work. And to do this, we can make shot a child of shot spawn, and then we can reset the positioning of shot relative to our shot spawn and also our player position. Then to get a closer look of what we've done, we just highlight the game object, hover your cursor into the scene view, and then press F, and you should be able to have a nice close view of your game objects. So with the shot spawn game object selected, we want to increase its value on the y-axis to make sure that it actually looks like bullets are coming out from our tank. Now we know that our transformation values are relative to the player object, so let's play around with some values on the y position to see where we can have our bullet spawn from. So 1 seems a bit too far out. Let's try 0.5. But let's just try a little further out so that the shot doesn't look like it's colliding with the barrel of our tank. I found that 0.65 is a good value for me to have the position of my shot spawn. Once we've done that, we can unattach the shot as a child of our shot spawn by simply clicking on it and just dragging it away from our shot spawn game object, and we'll just leave the shot spawn game object as a child of the player game object. Now to actually have our shots be instantiated into the scene, what we need is a script. So let's go to our player game object and then go to add component, new script, but in my case I've already got my script prepared, but you guys should know the drill by now. So I'll be seeing you in MonoDevelop. Okay, so now that we're back in MonoDevelop, let's explain and take a look at what our tank shot script actually does for us. So we've got a public game object, which is shot. Now this allows us to, in the inspector in Unity, select the game object that we want to be instantiated as a shot, which we see the script for right here. Now public transform shot spawn allows us to assign a game object positioned where we want our shots to spawn from, and fire rate is also implemented to make sure that we can control how fast our player can shoot, because without a fire rate things can get a little chaotic. Now under void update here we have if input.get button. Now we've seen this. Now with this Now what this part of the script is talking about is if we input a certain button, which I've set to be jump, and now what this part of the script says is that if we make an input on our keyboard using a button, which Unity calls jump, but also known as our spacebar, a certain event will take place, and this is accompanied by the calculations for our fire rate. Now once we've done this, and once the fire rate is established, we're going to instantiate an instance of the shot at the position that we've dictated using our empty game object shot spawn, which we just created a minute ago. So once you've got all of this script sorted, we just want to click File and then Save again and return to Unity, and I'll show you how you can use these parts of your script to continue building this game. Now with the player object selected, we want to add our shot spawn and our actual shot prefab. So what we're going to do is we're going to take shot spawn right here and just drag it into this box, and that's going to be our transformation position where all of our shots are going to come from. Now we don't need shot in the hierarchy anymore because we've set it as a prefab, so we can delete that and then go to our prefabs folder and then highlight player again and then just drag this prefab into our shot box. And that is how we can establish the position from which our shots will come from and the shots that we want to use. Now once we press play, we can see what happens. But first I'm going to change this fire rate to its default just to show you guys what happens if we don't actually select a fire rate. Okay, so we've got everything working, but now you can see what happens if we do not select a fire rate. We actually get something that looks like a fire hydrant, which is not what we want. This is not the intended result. So I'm just going to up this fire rate just to show you guys what happens once we do that. And as you can see, we've got a much more controlled rate of fire, and also we're not filling up our game too quickly with any of the shot clones. But we are filling it up slowly nonetheless. So we need to figure out a way to remedy this, or otherwise this is going to be an issue in the long run for the performance of the game as it carries on. So now let's exit the play mode. Alright, now we are in the final stage of this part, and we're going to create a boundary to make sure that our bullets are destroyed once they leave the view of the main camera, so we don't have to worry about them taking up too much space on the hierarchy and too many of our resources. So as with other game objects, what we want to do is right click in the hierarchy, go to 3D object, and this time we're going to select cube. Now we want to make sure that our cube is positioned on the Z axis in line with our player object and the shots that it is shooting, which it in fact is because its Z position is set to 4. And then we want to reset where it is on the Y axis to origin. Now let's zoom out a bit and take a look at this. We then want to scale up our cube to make sure that it fills out the whole view of the main camera. So let's scale it up on the Z axis by about 7, and let's scale it up on the y-axis by about 10, and that seems like a perfect fit. For the sides, we don't have to worry too much because our bullets aren't going to be escaping the view of the main camera, leaving in sideways directions. It's just not going to happen. So now that we've got this cube, let's take a look at our game mode. Now this is pretty disappointing, and that's not what we want. We want a good game. And this is actually an easy fix. We just need to go to this mesh renderer for our cube game object, make sure you have the cube selected, and then uncheck mesh renderer. And that's completely fine to not have the mesh renderer selected because we're only using this cube for its box collider. So if we go to the scene view again, we can see that its box collider is wrapped nicely around the view of the main camera, and that is most definitely what we want. So we're going to go to add component, physics, and then rigid body so that we can reference the game object once we've added a script to it. Then we're going to go to add component, new script, but in my case we're going to go to add component and then script, and I've called my script shot boundary. Now the reason that there's a space between this is because I capitalized the B, and when you're typing up the name for your script, make sure you just type capital S on the shot and then capital B on the boundary, no space in between, and you should be good to go. Now let's get back to MonoDevelop for the third time. So with a record amount of visits to MonoDevelop, we are back with our third and final script, which is our shot boundary script. Now this script is actually very simple and it won't take a long time for me to deconstruct it. So it says void onTriggerExit collider dot other. So once an object that we've referenced right here leaves the space of the box collider, it is going to be destroyed. Now that object we've referenced as other.gameObject.transform.parent.gameObject, and that is why it is very important to make sure that you followed the steps that I took in attaching parents and childs to different game objects as I demonstrated earlier into this tutorial, because the way that we've referenced it is a bit specific. Now once that game object leaves, we're going to destroy it, which means that it's going to be deleted from our scene. And once you've got that script ready, you just want to go to File, Save, and then go back to Unity, and we'll start by looking at how this script works. So luckily for this script, as you can see in the inspector, we don't have to attach anything. All we need to do is press play and see what happens. So now that I'm in the play mode, I will shoot my first shot just to demonstrate what is going to happen. Now as you can see, I'm shooting my shots consistently, but one thing that we're noticing is that they're still filling up the hierarchy. Now why is this? Well, we've made one small but vital mistake, which can be remedied very quickly but always needs to be taken into consideration. So once we exit our play mode, we can go back to our cube, and then where it says box collider, we just need to check is trigger. And still with our cube game component selected, we just want to go down to that rigid body and deselect use gravity, because that will fall if we do not deselect that. Now let's see what happens if we enter our game and start firing shots. So as you can see, I am now shooting shots, and they are indeed being removed from our hierarchy as they are leaving the view of the main camera, which is the intended result. Now that we've got all of those things sorted, we've got our main shooting mechanics ready for our game. So now we can continue on to making barriers and destroying enemies. But this seems like a good time just to leave our project because we've made a lot of progress in this part. Again, this has been another press any button Space Invaders tutorial in Unity. I'm really enjoying this series, and I'm really enjoying the positivity and the support that you guys bring to the channel. So for that, thank you. If you like the video, then there's plenty more you can find on the channel and plenty more in store. If you feel like you've got something to say about the series, then you can leave that down in the comments. If you want to like, I will not hold it against you if you like this video. And if you would like to subscribe, then feel free to do so, because I've got a lot more on the way. Anyway, for now, as always, this has been me, and I'll be back another time.